Picture the unforgiving wilderness of Colorado Territory in 1864, where towering granite cliffs pierce an endless sky and the whisper of pine needles carries secrets darker than the mountain shadows themselves. Imagine a world where a single moment of courage could mean the difference between life and death, where a mother's love becomes the only shield against forces that show no mercy to the innocent dot in this harsh landscape of jagged peaks and hidden valleys, where civilization clings desperately to footholds carved from stone and determination. One woman's desperate choice would test every boundary between survival and sacrifice. This is the story of faith forged in terror, of hope discovered in the deepest darkness, and of an unlikely encounter that would challenge everything both enemies believed about courage, honor, and the true meaning of strength. Here, where eagles soar above ancient burial grounds, and the echoes of war drums still thunder through canyon walls, prepare to witness how the fiercest protection comes not from weapons or walls, but from a heart willing to risk everything for those who cannot protect themselves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn morning of 1864 found Sarah Elizabeth Manning standing in the doorway of the little schoolhouse she had built with her own hands, watching 5 pairs of eager eyes turn toward her with the kind of trust that both warmed and terrified her heart. At 28, Sarah possessed the kind of quiet strength that frontier life demanded, but it was a strength that had been tested by losses that would have broken lesser souls. Her wheat-colored hair was pulled back in a practical bun that never quite contained the rebellious strands that escaped to frame her face, and her green eyes held depths that spoke of sorrows carried and burdens accepted without complaint. She had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of frontier education with the same careful precision her late husband had once used to guide their wagon across dangerous mountain passes. The children before her represented the future of Willow Creek Settlement, a small community of 37 families who had carved their existence from the unforgiving slopes of the Colorado Rockies. 8-year-old Emma Thompson sat in the front row, her dark pigtails tied with ribbons her mother had treasured since their journey west. Beside her, 10-year-old James Patterson wrestled with arithmetic problems that seemed designed to defeat his restless spirit, while 12-year-old Mary Catherine Wells helped 6-year-old twins Billy and Bobby Henderson sound out words from the precious McGuffey reader that Sarah had carried from her former life in Ohio. Each child carried their own story of hardship and hope. Emma's father had died in a mining accident the previous spring, leaving her mother to run their small general store while caring for 2 younger siblings. James had been born during the arduous journey west, his parents having lost 3 older children to cholera along the Oregon Trail. Mary Catherine had witnessed her grandmother's death during their first terrible winter in the mountains, and the Henderson twins had never known any life except this harsh existence where survival depended on everyone contributing their share to the community's welfare. Sarah had become more than their teacher. She was their guardian, their protector, and sometimes their only source of stability in a world that seemed determined to test the limits of human endurance. The responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders, made more burdensome by the knowledge that her own past held secrets that could endanger everything she had worked to build. 3 years earlier, Sarah Manning had been Sarah Elizabeth Carson, wife of Captain Robert Carson of the Colorado Territorial Militia. Their marriage had been one of genuine love and shared dreams of building something meaningful in the untamed territory. Robert had been a fair man, unusual for his time, who believed that peaceful coexistence with indigenous peoples was not only possible but necessary for the survival of both cultures. Their home had been a gathering place where military officers, territorial officials, and even friendly tribal representatives could meet on neutral ground to discuss trade agreements and territorial boundaries. Sarah had served as hostess for these delicate negotiations, learning to navigate the complex cultural protocols that governed interactions. between peoples who viewed the world through fundamentally different lenses. But Robert's progressive views had made him enemies among those who preferred simple solutions to complex problems. When tensions escalated into open warfare, he had been reassigned to increasingly dangerous positions until finally, he had been killed during what was officially described as a routine patrol, but which Sarah suspected had been deliberately planned to eliminate a voice of moderation that threatened more aggressive policies. The grief that followed had nearly destroyed her. For months, she had existed in a haze of despair, unable to eat, sleep, or find meaning in a world that had suddenly become cold and empty. But gradually, as the numbness began to lift, she realized that Robert's death had also freed her from the social obligations that had defined her life as an officer's wife. She could choose her own path, build something that honored his memory while serving her own need to make a difference in the world. The decision to become a teacher had surprised everyone who knew her. Officers' wives were expected to remarry quickly, transferring their social status and security to new husbands who could provide appropriate protection and support. Instead, Sarah had used her widow's pension to purchase basic teaching supplies and had set out for the frontier settlements where educated women were desperately needed but rarely available. Willow Creek had welcomed her with the gratitude of people who understood the value of education but had no idea how to provide it for their children. The settlement's location high in the mountains made it relatively safe from the Indian troubles that plagued lower elevations, but it also meant that outside resources were scarce and expensive. Sarah's arrival had been seen as providential, a gift that would give their children opportunities that none of the adults had ever possessed. She had thrown herself into the work with an intensity that amazed her neighbors. The schoolhouse had been built with lumber donated by every family in the settlement, but Sarah had personally supervised every aspect of construction to ensure that it would serve her students' needs. She had designed large windows to provide maximum light for reading, a fireplace positioned to warm the entire space efficiently, and storage areas for the books and supplies she hoped to accumulate over time. But building the school had been only the beginning. Sarah had quickly discovered that frontier education required creativity and flexibility that no normal school training could have prepared her for. Her students ranged in age from 6 to 15, with wildly different levels of preparation and ability. Some could barely write their own names, while others had received excellent early education from parents who valued learning, but lacked the time to continue formal instruction. She had developed innovative teaching methods that allowed older students to help younger ones while advancing their own understanding through the process of explanation and demonstration. Mathematics lessons incorporated practical skills like measuring lumber and calculating supply costs. Reading instruction used newspapers and letters from back east to connect her students with the larger world beyond their mountain isolation. Most importantly, Sarah had recognized that education in such a harsh environment needed to build character as well as knowledge. She taught her students about courage, integrity, and the importance of caring for those who were weaker or less fortunate. These lessons had proven their value countless times as the children learned to support each other through family crises, personal setbacks, and the constant challenges of frontier life. The morning routine she had established reflected her understanding that learning required both structure and flexibility. Classes began with everyone reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, not from patriotic duty, but because the shared ritual created a sense of unity and purpose that helped focus scattered young minds on the work ahead. Arithmetic came first when mental energy was highest, followed by reading instruction that often extended into discussions of geography, history, and moral philosophy. But today felt different. Sarah had noticed unusual activity in the settlement during the past week, men gathering in quiet conversations that stopped when women approached, extra ammunition being moved into homes, and a general tension that reminded her uncomfortably of the atmosphere that had preceded Robert's final assignment. The children seemed to sense it too. their usual boisterous energy replaced by a nervous alertness that made concentration difficult. Emma Thompson raised her hand tentatively. "Miss Manning, Mama said I might not be able to come to school for a few days." She didn't say why, but she looked scared. The innocent question struck Sarah's heart like a physical blow. Emma's mother, Jennifer Thompson, was one of the strongest women in the settlement, someone who had never shown fear even during the worst blizzards or food shortages. If Jennifer Thompson was scared enough for her 8-year-old daughter to notice, then the situation was far more serious than Sarah had realized. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions to keep their families safe. Sarah replied carefully, choosing her words to provide reassurance without dismissing legitimate concerns. "Your mother loves you very much, and if she thinks you should stay home for a while, then we should trust her judgment." But Mary Catherine Wells, always the most perceptive of her students, pressed for more information. "My pa was cleaning his rifle last night, and he told not to pack food in case we had to leave quickly. Are we in danger, Miss Manning?" The direct question forced Sarah to confront the reality she had been trying to avoid. The children deserved honesty, but they also deserved protection from fears that might prove groundless. More importantly, she needed to maintain their trust while preparing them for possibilities that no child should have to face. "There have been some disagreements between different groups of people in our territory," she said slowly, weighing each word for its impact on young minds already stretched by too much uncertainty. "Sometimes when adults can't agree on important matters, they make choices that affect everyone around them. Your parents are being careful because being careful is always wise, even when danger might not come." James Patterson, whose restless energy usually made sitting still a challenge, had been unusually quiet all morning. Now he spoke up with the kind of blunt honesty that characterized frontier children who had learned early that survival depended on facing reality directly. "My Peo says the Comanche are coming. He says they're angry about the soldiers killing their families down south, and they're going to make everyone pay for it. Is that true, Miss Manning?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that Sarah wished she could dismiss but knew she could not ignore. The Colorado Territory had been increasingly unstable as conflicts escalated between various tribal groups and territorial authorities. Reports from the South spoke of massacres, retaliations, and a cycle of violence that seemed to be spiraling beyond anyone's ability to control. Sarah had hoped that Willow Creek's remote location and the settlement's history of peaceful relationships with local tribes would provide protection from the broader conflicts. But if James Patterson's father was talking about Comanche war parties, then the situation had deteriorated far beyond what she had understood. "I don't know what's going to happen, James," she said finally, recognizing that anything less than complete honesty would destroy the trust she had spent 3 years building with these children. "But I do know that whatever happens, we'll face it together. That's what families do, and that's what we are, a family that takes care of each other no matter what." The Henderson twins, Billy and Bobby, had been listening with the wide-eyed intensity that 6-year-olds brought to adult conversations they couldn't fully understand but knew were important. Bobby, the more talkative of the two, raised his small hand with urgent concern. "Miss Manning, if bad men come, will you protect us like our mama does?" The innocent question pierced Sarah's heart with its absolute faith in her ability to shield them from harm. These children had learned to trust her completely, believing with the simple certainty of childhood that adults could always keep them safe. The weight of that trust was almost unbearable, especially when she knew that the protection they needed might exceed anything she could provide. "I will do everything in my power to keep you safe," she promised, making a vow that she knew might require her to sacrifice everything she valued, including her own life. That's what teachers do for their students, and that's what people who love each other do for their families. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself watching the horizon through the schoolhouse windows with increasing anxiety. The settlements. Location provided excellent views of the approaches from 3 directions, but it also meant that anyone observing from the surrounding peaks could monitor their activities with equal clarity. The defensive advantages that had originally attracted settlers to this location could become dangerous vulnerabilities if hostile forces decided to exploit them. By midday, the tension that had been building throughout the morning reached a breaking point when Daniel Patterson, James's father, appeared at the schoolhouse door with an expression that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. His weathered face was grim with the kind of controlled panic that spoke of immediate and serious danger. "Miss Manning," he said quietly, his voice carefully modulated to avoid alarming the children while conveying urgent necessity. "We need to talk privately for a moment." Sarah instructed her students to continue their reading assignments while she stepped outside with Daniel. The conversation that followed confirmed everything she had been dreading and more. Scouts had reported a large war party moving through the territory, led by a Comanche chief whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his ruthlessness toward anyone he considered an enemy. The settlement's men were preparing for siege, but they recognized that their small numbers and limited ammunition made successful defense unlikely if the attack came with the force that scouts were reporting. Evacuation was being considered, but the approaching winter weather made travel with children and elderly residents extremely dangerous. "We're between a rock and a hard place," Daniel admitted grimly. "Stay and fight with poor odds, or run into mountains that could kill us just as dead as any war party." Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet as she realized that everything she had built, everything she had hoped to accomplish, was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The children depending on her trust were about to face dangers that no education could prepare them for, and she was about to discover whether her promises of protection had any meaning when confronted with forces beyond her control. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah felt something else rising in her chest, a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. These children were her responsibility, her family, her legacy of Robert's belief that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. Whatever was coming, she would find a way to keep them safe, even if it meant facing the darkness alone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The emergency meeting in the settlement's makeshift community hall that evening revealed the full scope of the crisis facing Willow Creek. Sarah sat among the 37 adult residents, listening as Scout Thomas Bradford delivered intelligence that turned her blood to ice water. The war party approaching their location was led by Chief Gray Wolf, a legendary Comanche warrior whose tactical genius had made him both feared and respected across 3 territories. "Gray Wolf isn't just another raider looking for horses and supplies," Bradford explained to the tense gathering. "He's conducting what the military calls a strategic campaign. This man has been planning coordinated strikes against isolated settlements for months, and everything we've seen suggests Willow Creek is next on his list." Martha Henderson, mother of the 6-year-old twins in Sarah's class, raised a trembling hand. "How much time do we have?" Bradford's weathered face was grim in the lamplight. "Based on their current pace and the terrain they'll need to cross, I'd estimate 36 hours. Maybe less if they push through the night." The number hit the assembly like a physical blow. 36 hours to prepare for an assault that would determine whether their community survived or joined the growing list of settlements that existed now only as charred ruins and bitter memories. Sarah felt her teacher's mind automatically begin calculating 36 hours to finalize evacuation plans, gather essential supplies, and somehow prepare 5 children for an ordeal that might test the limits of human endurance. Mayor William Foster, a former cavalry sergeant whose missing left arm testified to his own encounters with frontier violence, stood to address the group. "We've got 3 options, and none of them are good. We can try to defend the settlement, but we're outnumbered at least 4 to 1 by experienced warriors. We can evacuate toward Fort Carson, but that's a week's journey through mountain passes. That could kill us if the weather turns. Or we can scatter and hide, hoping they'll move on after taking what they want." The debate that followed revealed the deep divisions that crisis could create, even among people who had lived and worked together for years. The younger men, led by blacksmith Robert Hayes, argued for a fighting defense that would at least allow them to die protecting their homes and families. The older residents, remembering similar conflicts that had devastated other communities, favored evacuation despite the risks. But it was Jennifer Thompson, Emma's mother and the unofficial voice of the settlement's women, who introduced the option that no one wanted to consider, but everyone knew might be necessary. "What about the children?" she asked quietly. "If we fight and lose, they'll be killed or captured. If we try to evacuate and get caught in the open, they'll slow us down and get everyone killed. Maybe we need to think about hiding them separately." The suggestion created a moment of profound silence as parents contemplated the unthinkable separating from their children in the hope that survival might be possible even if reunion was not. Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her, recognizing that any plan involving the children would require her participation and leadership. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the settlement's physician and one of its founding members, spoke the words that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to voice. "There are caves in the ridge system about 2 miles north of here. Natural formations that could shelter a small group for days or even weeks if necessary. The approaches are difficult enough that they might escape notice during a raid." Sarah's mind immediately grasped the implications. The caves Dr. Morrison referenced were part of an extensive network that she had explored during her first summer in Willow Creek. They offered natural protection from weather and observation, but they also represented isolation that would cut any hidden group off from help if something went wrong. "I know those caves," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the hushed assembly. "They're defensible and well concealed, but reaching them would require travel across open ground. And once there, anyone hiding would be completely on their own." The practical challenges of such a plan began to emerge as the discussion continued. Food and water would need to be pre-positioned. Emergency supplies including medical materials, warm clothing, and basic tools would require careful selection and transport. Most critically, the children would need to be prepared psychologically for an experience that could traumatize them permanently, even if they survived physically. Margaret Wells, Mary Catherine's mother and the settlement's schoolmarm before Sarah's arrival, raised the question that cut to the heart of every parent's anguish. Who would go with them? Someone would have to stay with the children, but that person would be cut off from any hope of rescue if things go badly. Again, every eye turned toward Sarah. As the children's teacher, she was the obvious choice for such a mission. Her single status meant that her absence wouldn't leave a husband without support, and her experience navigating frontier dangers made her the most qualified candidate for keeping children alive under extreme conditions. But Sarah understood that accepting such responsibility would mean more than simply babysitting 5 youngsters in uncomfortable surroundings. She would become their sole protector, their only connection to safety and civilization, their final barrier against forces that might prove completely beyond her ability to resist. "I'll do it," she said simply, the words coming from some deep well of determination that surprised even her. "If that's what we decide, I'll take the children to the caves and keep them safe until this is over." The immediate relief that flooded the room was almost palpable. Parents who had been facing impossible choices suddenly saw a path that offered their children genuine hope for survival. But Sarah recognized that her commitment had also created new pressures and expectations that would test every skill and strength she possessed. The remainder of the meeting focused on practical preparations that would need to be completed within the next 24 hours. Supplies would be gathered and transported to the cave system under cover of darkness. The children would be told only what they needed to know to cooperate without being paralyzed by fear. And Sarah would need to transform herself from frontier schoolteacher into wilderness guardian, capable of protecting 5 lives under conditions that would challenge experienced FRONTIERS MEN. As the assembly dispersed into the mountain night, Sarah found herself surrounded by parents who wanted to discuss specific arrangements for their children. Jennifer Thompson gripped her hands with desperate intensity, speaking in urgent whispers about Emma's tendency toward nightmares and her need for the small cloth doll that provided comfort during times of stress. "She's never been away from me for more than a day," Jennifer confided, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I don't know how she handled being separated, especially under these circumstances." Daniel Patterson was equally concerned about his son James, whose restless energy and natural leadership tendencies could create problems in a situation requiring absolute silence and obedience. "The boy means well, but he's never learned to think before he acts. In the caves, that could get everyone killed." Mary Catherine's parents worried about their daughter's tendency to take responsibility for others' welfare, fearing that she might sacrifice her own safety to protect the younger children. The Henderson family faced the unique challenge of 6-year-old twins, whose different personalities would require careful management to prevent conflicts that could compromise everyone's security. Each conversation revealed the profound love and desperate hope that motivated parents facing an impossible situation. These people were being forced to choose between keeping their children close and giving them their best chance for survival, a decision that would haunt them regardless of the outcome. Sarah listened to every concern, taking mental notes about each child's special needs and potential challenges. But underneath her careful attention to practical details, she felt a growing awareness of the enormous responsibility she was accepting. These weren't just students who looked to her for education and guidance. They were becoming her sacred trust, 5 precious lives whose survival would depend entirely on her wisdom, courage, and determination. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic preparation that tested the entire community's ability to work together under extreme pressure. Men who should have been resting before a possible battle instead carried supplies through dangerous terrain in complete darkness. Women who should have been spending precious time with their families instead packed emergency provisions and medical supplies with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that overlooking a single necessity could mean death. Sarah found herself at the center of this controlled chaos, making decisions about everything from food selection to psychological preparation. She chose supplies that would provide maximum nutrition and comfort, while remaining light enough for rapid transport. She planned activities that could keep 5 children occupied and calm during what might be days or weeks of enforced confinement. Most challenging of all, she prepared herself mentally for the possibility that her mission might require her to make choices no teacher should ever face. If discovery became imminent, would she have the strength to keep the children quiet regardless of their fear? If food ran short, could she sacrifice her own needs to ensure their survival? And if the worst happened, would she be able to protect them from horrors that her imagination refused to fully contemplate? The cave system that would become their refuge was located in a granite ridge that rose like a natural fortress above the valley floor. The main chamber was large enough to accommodate 6 people comfortably, with smaller connecting passages that could provide emergency escape routes if the primary entrance became compromised. A natural spring provided fresh water, while strategically positioned openings offered ventilation without creating visibility from external observation points. But Sarah recognized that the cave's advantages were balanced by significant dangers. The rock formations that provided concealment could also become traps if hostile forces discovered their location. The isolation that offered protection from immediate discovery would also prevent any hope of rescue if circumstances changed. Most critically, the psychological pressure of confinement combined with fear could create behavior problems that might compromise everyone's safety. As she made her final preparations, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she had been a grieving widow seeking meaning through service to others. Tomorrow, she would become the sole guardian of 5 children whose survival would depend entirely on her ability to navigate challenges that would test every limit of human endurance. The irony was not lost on her that in trying to build something positive from her personal tragedy, she had created new possibilities for loss that could dwarf anything she had previously experienced. But she also recognized that some responsibilities transcended personal comfort or safety. These children represented the future, not just of Willow Creek, but of the idea that communities could create something better than the violence and hatred that seemed to dominate frontier existence. Whatever happened in the caves, whatever choices she was forced to make, Sarah was determined that her students would survive to see that better future, even if it meant sacrificing everything else she valued, including her own life, to make that survival possible. The pre-dawn hours of what might be Willow Creek's final day began with the kind of controlled chaos that accompanies this imprint action. Sarah moved through the settlement like a woman possessed, making final preparations for a journey that could determine whether 5 children lived to see another sunrise. The weight of her responsibility felt heavier with each passing moment, but she pushed forward with the grim determination of someone who understood that hesitation could prove fatal. Emma Thompson stood in her mother's kitchen, clutching her precious cloth doll while trying to understand why Mama was crying as she packed a small bundle of clothes. At 8 years old, Emma possessed the kind of innocent wisdom that allowed her to sense adult fear without fully comprehending its source. She had heard whispered conversations about bad men coming and going to a safe place, but the reality of separation from everything familiar was only beginning to penetrate her childish understanding. "Mama, why can't you come to the safe place too?" Emma asked, her voice small and uncertain in the dim lamplight. Jennifer Thompson knelt beside her daughter, struggling to find words that would provide comfort without creating false hopes. "Miss Manning is going to take very good care of you and the other children. She knows special places where you'll be safe while the grown-ups handle some difficult problems. But you have to promise me you'll be brave and do exactly what she tells you, even if you don't understand why." The conversation was repeated in variations throughout the settlement as other parents faced the agonizing task of preparing their children for separation. James Patterson received stern lectures about controlling his impulsive nature and following instructions without question. Mary Catherine Wells was given additional responsibilities for helping care for the younger children, her natural maternal instincts being channeled into survival strategy. The Henderson twins presented unique challenges for their parents, who struggled to explain complex dangers to 6-year-old minds that processed information in concrete rather than abstract terms. Billy and Bobby understood that they were going on an adventure with Miss Manning, but they couldn't grasp why their parents seemed so sad about something that sounded exciting. Sarah arrived at each home to collect her charges, noting the brave faces that parents wore for their children's benefit, while observing the barely controlled desperation that lurked behind every forced smile. These people were making the ultimate parental sacrifice, choosing their children's survival over their own emotional needs, and the courage required for such decisions left her humbled and determined to prove worthy of their trust. The trek to the cave system began while stars still dominated the Colorado sky, a small procession moving through familiar terrain that felt transformed by danger and urgency. Sarah led the group along paths she had walked countless times during peaceful afternoons, but now every shadow seemed to conceal potential threats and every sound carried implications of discovery and disaster. She had divided the children into pairs for the journey, with Mary Catherine responsible for guiding Emma while James helped the Henderson twins navigate the rocky terrain. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It distributed responsibility while creating mutual support systems that could prove crucial during the challenging days ahead. The supplies they carried represented careful calculations about survival. Priorities. Food was limited to high-energy items that would sustain them for up to a week. Water containers were supplemented by knowledge of the natural spring within the cave system. Medical supplies focused on treating injuries and illnesses that could prove fatal without proper attention. Most importantly, Sarah carried weapons that she hoped never to use, but knew might become their only protection against forces that showed no mercy to the innocent Dot as they climbed higher into the granite ridges that would provide their sanctuary. The children's initial excitement gradually gave way to fatigue and growing apprehension. The reality of leaving home and family behind was beginning to penetrate their consciousness, creating emotional challenges that Sarah knew would only intensify once they reached their destination. Emma began crying softly as the settlement disappeared from view behind intervening ridges. "I want to go home, Miss Manning. I want my mama." The heartbroken plea nearly shattered Sarah's composure, but she forced herself to respond with calm reassurance. "I know you miss your mama, sweetheart. She misses you too. But right now, the most important thing is keeping you safe so you can see her again when the danger is over." James Patterson, despite his parents' warnings about impulsive behavior, couldn't resist asking the questions that all the children were thinking. "Miss Manning, what if the bad men find us? What if our parents get hurt? What if we never get to go home?" The direct challenge forced Sarah to confront fears that she had been trying to suppress since accepting this mission. These children deserved honest answers, but they also needed hope and confidence that would sustain them through whatever ordeals lay ahead. "James, I won't lie to you about the dangers we're facing," she said carefully, choosing words that acknowledged reality without crushing spirit. "Bad things might happen, and we might have to be very brave for longer than we'd like. But your parents are strong and smart people who know how to take care of themselves. And I promise you that I will do everything in my power to keep you safe and get you home to them." The cave entrance, when they finally reached it, appeared less like a refuge than a mouth leading into unknown darkness. The natural opening was partially concealed by fallen boulders and hardy vegetation. But once inside, the space opened into a chamber large enough to accommodate their small group with room for movement and basic activities. Sarah had visited these caves during peaceful exploration, but seeing them as a potential home for indefinite duration created new appreciation for both their advantages and limitations. The main chamber provided protection from weather and observation, while connecting passages offered emergency escape routes if their primary entrance became compromised. But the isolation was complete and daunting, cutting them off from any hope of outside assistance if circumstances deteriorated. The process of establishing their underground home revealed character traits that Sarah had observed in classroom settings but never seen tested under genuine pressure. Mary Catherine immediately began organizing the younger children and helping to arrange their limited supplies with the efficiency of someone much older than her 12 years. James channeled his restless energy into practical tasks like gathering firewood and exploring the cave's layout for potential defensive positions. Emma retreated into herself, finding comfort in her doll while processing the overwhelming changes that had transformed her secure world into something frightening and uncertain. The Henderson twins reacted differently to their new environment, with Billy adapting quickly to what he viewed as an exciting adventure while Bobby became increasingly clingy and fearful as the reality of their situation penetrated his young understanding. Sarah recognized that managing these different responses would require all her skills as both teacher and surrogate parent. She needed to provide structure and routine that would give the children psychological anchors while remaining flexible enough to address individual needs and unexpected crises. Most critically, she had to project confidence and calm even when her own fears threatened to overwhelm her. Rational mind, the first full day in the caves established patterns that would define their existence for however long their exile lasted. Morning began with simple prayers and breakfast, followed by lessons that served dual purposes of education and distraction. Sarah had brought books and writing materials, recognizing that intellectual engagement would be crucial for maintaining morale and preventing the kind of despair that could destroy their will to survive. But education in the caves took on dimensions that no normal classroom could have provided. Lessons in mathematics involved calculating food rations and water consumption. Geography included detailed study of the cave system and surrounding terrain. History focused on stories of courage and survival that could provide inspiration during their darkest moments. The children adapted to their new environment with the resilience that youth often displayed in extreme circumstances. But Sarah observed warning signs that suggested future challenges. Emma's withdrawal was deepening despite gentle encouragement to participate in group activities. James's natural leadership was beginning to manifest as impatience with the younger children's fears and limitations. Mary Catherine was shouldering responsibility beyond her years, a pattern that could lead to emotional breakdown if the pressure became too intense. Most concerning were the Henderson twins, whose different responses to stress were creating conflicts that threatened group harmony. Billy's adaptation was creating resentment in Bobby, who felt abandoned by his brother's apparent indifference to their separation from home and family. The dynamic was subtle but dangerous, representing the kind of internal division that could prove fatal if external pressure increased. As their first evening in the caves approached, Sarah gathered the children around their small fire for what she hoped would become a comforting ritual. She told stories from her own childhood, shared memories of their life in Willow Creek, and encouraged each child to express their feelings about their new situation. But underneath the facade of normalcy, she was acutely aware that their real test had not yet begun. Somewhere beyond the safety of their stone walls, forces were moving that would determine whether their sacrifice had meaning or whether they were simply delaying an inevitable reckoning. The war party led by Chief Gray Wolf was approaching Willow Creek with the kind of methodical precision that had made him legendary throughout the territory. Soon, very soon, they would discover whether their hiding place could truly protect them from forces that showed no mercy to anyone who stood in their path. But for now, in the flickering light of their cave fire, 5 children trusted completely in the woman who had promised to keep them safe. That trust was both Sarah's greatest strength and her most crushing burden, a responsibility that would be tested in ways that none of them could yet imagine. As darkness settled over the Colorado mountains, Sarah Manning prepared for what might be the longest night of her life, knowing that somewhere in that darkness, enemies were approaching who would test every promise she had made and every skill she possessed. The real ordeal was about to begin. The second dawn in the caves brought no sunlight, only a gradual lightening of the darkness that filtered through the narrow opening Sarah had designated as their window to the outside world. She had been awake since before midnight, listening to sounds that could have been wind through pine branches or the movement of forces that preferred to travel under cover of darkness. Every instinct honed by 3 years of frontier living told her that this day would bring the reckoning they had all been dreading. The children stirred restlessly in their makeshift beds, unconsciously sensing the tension that seemed to radiate from the very stone around them. Emma Thompson whimpered softly in her sleep, her small hands clutching the cloth doll that had become her lifeline to everything familiar and safe. Beside her, Mary Catherine Wells lay with the alert stillness of someone much older, her 12-year-old mind processing dangers that most adults preferred not to contemplate. James Patterson's natural restlessness had intensified during their confinement, and Sarah could see signs of the rebellious energy That might soon challenge her authority if their situation didn't resolve quickly. The Henderson twins presented their own concerns. Billy had adapted with disturbing ease to their underground existence, while Bobby grew more withdrawn with each passing hour, his 6-year-old psyche struggling to process the magnitude of their separation from everything he had known. The breakfast routine she had established served purposes beyond simple nutrition. The familiar activities of preparing food and gathering around their small fire created psychological anchors that helped maintain some semblance of normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. But this morning, even those comforting rituals felt strained as everyone sensed that fundamental changes were approaching. "Miss Manning," Mary Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of burning wood. "I heard something strange during the night, like voices carrying on the wind, but too far away to understand." Sarah's blood chilled at the observation. Mary Catherine possessed unusually keen hearing and an intuitive understanding of frontier dangers that made her reports particularly credible. If the girl had detected voices in the distance, it could mean that Gray Wolf's war party had reached the Willow Creek area ahead of the expected timeline. "What kind of voices?" Sarah asked quietly, hoping that her tone didn't betray the alarm that was coursing through her system. Men talking, but not in English. And there was something else like metal hitting stone. Maybe weapons or tools, but it didn't sound like our people working. The description confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Metal hitting stone could indicate war lances being sharpened or rifle barrels being cleaned against granite surfaces. Voices speaking in non-English languages suggested that indigenous forces were indeed operating in their immediate vicinity. The timeline for their ordeal had just accelerated dramatically. James Patterson, whose restless nature made him acutely sensitive to adult anxiety, immediately picked up on the tension that Mary Catherine's report had created. "Are they here? Are the bad men really here?" The direct question forced Sarah to make a critical decision about how much truth these children could handle. Complete honesty might trigger panic that could compromise their safety, but false reassurance would destroy the trust that kept them united under impossible circumstances. "There might be strangers in our area," she said carefully, choosing words that acknowledged reality without creating despair. "That's exactly why we came to this safe place. Now more than ever, we need to be very quiet and very careful about following the rules we discussed." The rules she referenced had been drilled into each child during their first day in the caves. No talking above a whisper during daylight hours. No movement near the cave entrance without explicit permission. Absolute silence at any sign of external activity. Most importantly, complete obedience to Sarah's instructions, regardless of their personal feelings or fears. Emma Thompson began, crying softly, the kind of heartbroken whimpering that 8-year-olds produced when their world exceeded their capacity for understanding. The sound sent daggers through Sarah's heart, but she knew that emotional comfort had to be balanced against practical security. Any noise that carried beyond their stone walls could draw exactly the kind of attention they were desperate to avoid. "Emma, sweetheart," she whispered, gathering the child into her arms with gentle firmness. "I know you're scared, and that's completely normal. But right now, being quiet is the most important thing you can do to keep everyone safe. Can you be brave for your mama and help protect your friends by staying very quiet?" The appeal to Emma's protective instincts rather than her fears proved more effective than simple commands for silence. The little girl nodded through her tears, accepting the cloth doll that Sarah offered while struggling to control the sobs that wanted to escape her overwrought system, but their efforts at maintaining silence were tested almost immediately by sounds from outside that made everyone freeze with terror. Heavy footsteps were moving across the rocky terrain above their hiding place. Not the careful movements of settlers who knew the area, but the confident strides of warriors who had claimed the territory as their own. The footsteps paused directly above the cave entrance, and Sarah felt her heart stop beating as she realized that discovery might be only moments away. She gathered the children closer to the deepest part of their chamber, positioning herself between them and the entrance while reaching for the loaded pistol that represented their final line of defense. Voices carried down from the surface, speaking in what Sarah recognized as Comanche dialect despite her limited understanding of the language. The tone was conversational rather than urgent, suggesting that the speakers had not yet detected signs of human habitation in the area. But their proximity meant that any careless noise could instantly transform their hiding place into a trap. Billy Henderson, whose 6-year-old understanding of danger was limited, but whose sense of adventure remained intact, started to move toward the cave entrance with obvious curiosity about the voices above. Sarah caught him with lightning reflexes, clamping her hand gently but firmly over his mouth while pulling him back into the shadows. The physical restraint triggered Bobby Henderson's growing anxiety, and the more sensitive twin began hyperventilating with the kind of panic that could escalate into screaming if not controlled immediately. Sarah found herself managing multiple crises simultaneously, keeping Billy quiet, calming Bobby's panic, and maintaining surveillance of the potential threat above their heads. Mary Catherine Wells demonstrated maturity far beyond her 12 years by immediately moving to help with the younger children. She gathered Emma and Bobby into a protective embrace while using silent gestures to communicate the absolute necessity for quiet behavior. Her natural leadership abilities were emerging under pressure, providing Sarah with desperately needed assistance during the most dangerous moments of their ordeal. The voices above continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, with occasional pauses that suggested the speakers were examining specific features of the terrain. Sarah strained to interpret their tone and movement patterns, looking for any indication of whether their hiding place had been compromised, or whether the search was moving on to other areas. Finally, mercifully, the footsteps began moving away from their position, heading deeper into the ridge system that surrounded Willow Creek Settlement. But Sarah knew that their reprieve was temporary at best. Gray Wolf's warriors were conducting systematic reconnaissance of the entire area, and it was only a matter of time before more thorough searches brought them back to investigate potential hiding places. The incident had revealed both strengths and weaknesses in their group dynamic that would need to be addressed before the next crisis. Mary Catherine's instinctive leadership and protective responses made her invaluable for managing the younger children. James's natural intelligence allowed him to understand dangers quickly and respond appropriately. But the Henderson twins presented ongoing challenges that could prove fatal if not resolved. Billy's curiosity and lack of fear, while admirable in normal circumstances, could get everyone killed if he couldn't learn to control his impulses. Bobby's increasing anxiety was creating a psychological fragility that might shatter completely under additional pressure. Both boys needed different types of support and management, but Sarah was running out of time and energy to provide individualized attention. As the immediate danger passed, Sarah gathered all 5 children for an emergency discussion about their situation. She needed to prepare them for the possibility that worse encounters lay ahead, while maintaining enough hope and courage to prevent complete emotional collapse. "That was very frightening," she began, acknowledging their shared terror while demonstrating that such feelings were normal and manageable. "But you all did exactly what you needed to do to stay safe." Mary Catherine helped take care of the younger children. James stayed calm and followed instructions. Emma was brave even though she was scared. Billy and Bobby remembered to stay quiet when it was most important. The praise was strategic as well as genuine, reinforcing behaviors that would be crucial for survival while building confidence that could sustain them through future crises. But Sarah also needed to prepare them for realities that might test every limit of their endurance. "There will probably be more times when strangers are near our hiding place," she continued carefully. "We might hear voices or footsteps or other sounds that scare us. But as long as we stay quiet and help each other be brave, our safe place will protect us until we can go home to our families." The promise of eventual reunion with their parents was both a hope and a prayer, something Sarah desperately wanted to believe but couldn't guarantee. The sounds they had heard suggested that Willow Creek was now under active threat, and the outcome of that conflict would determine whether there was still a home to return to when their cave ordeal finally ended. But for now, her responsibility was clear. 5 children depended on her for their survival, and she would find the strength to protect them regardless of what personal cost that protection might require. The real test of their hiding place had begun, and Sarah Manning was determined that when it ended, all 5 of her students would still be alive to continue their interrupted education. Outside their stone walls, forces were moving that would soon determine the fate of everyone she cared about. But inside the cave, a teacher's love and determination stood guard over 5 precious lives, ready to face whatever darkness the Colorado mountains might bring. The afternoon brought news that arrived not through human messengers, but through the very air itself, a distant rumbling that could have been thunder if the skies hadn't been crystal clear, could have been rock slides if the sound hadn't carried the unmistakable rhythm of coordinated destruction. From their position deep within the granite ridge, Sarah and her 5 charges listened to what could only be the systematic burning of everything they had called home. Smoke began drifting through the mountain air, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning wood, fabric, and dreams. Emma Thompson recognized the scent first, her 8-year-old memory connecting the familiar odor to the cozy fires of home hearths and her mother's cooking stove. But as the smell intensified and took on harsher undertones, even her young mind began to understand that something terrible was happening to the world beyond their stone walls. "Miss Manning," Mary Catherine whispered, her 12-year-old voice carrying a weight of understanding that no child should possess. "That's not campfire smoke. That's our homes burning, isn't it?" The question hung in the cave air like a physical presence, demanding an answer that Sarah desperately didn't want to give. These children had been clinging to the hope that their separation from family was temporary, that they would soon return to find their parents safe and their community intact. The destruction occurring in the valley below was shattering those hopes with each breath of smoke-laden air. James Patterson pressed himself against the cave wall nearest to their concealed entrance, his natural leadership instincts warring with the helplessness of their situation. At 10 years old, he possessed enough understanding of frontier warfare to grasp the implications of what they were witnessing, but not enough life experience to process the magnitude of loss that systematic destruction represented. "We should help them," he said with quiet desperation. "We should go down there and fight. We can't just hide while our families are in danger." The heroic impulse was exactly what Sarah had been fearing since their ordeal began. James possessed the kind of courage that could inspire others to greatness or lead them all to disaster, depending on how it was channeled. But rushing into a battle already lost would accomplish nothing except adding 5 more casualties to whatever tragedy was unfolding in Willow Creek. "James, I understand wanting to help," Sarah said carefully, recognizing that his emotions needed acknowledgement rather than dismissal. "That impulse to protect the people we love is exactly what makes you a good man. But sometimes the most important kind of courage is knowing when to wait, when to survive, so that we can help rebuild what's been destroyed." The philosophical distinction was lost on a 10-year-old whose world was literally going up in smoke, but Sarah hoped that her tone conveyed the respect and understanding that would keep his heroic instincts from overwhelming his survival sense. More importantly, she needed to prevent his restlessness from spreading to the other children, whose emotional stability was already stretched to breaking points. Bobby Henderson had withdrawn completely into himself, curled into a ball beside his twin brother while making the soft whimpering sounds that preceded complete psychological collapse in traumatized children. The contrast with Billy's continued alertness and curiosity created a dynamic that Sarah knew could explode into crisis if not carefully managed. The smoke continued to thicken throughout the afternoon, transforming their cave refuge into something that felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. The natural ventilation that had seemed adequate for their needs was struggling to clear air that grew increasingly difficult to breathe. But opening their concealed entrance to improve airflow would risk exposure to forces that might be conducting systematic searches of every possible hiding place. Emma Thompson had stopped crying, but her silence was more frightening than her tears had been. She sat motionless except for the mechanical stroking of her doll's yarn hair, her green eyes staring at nothing while her mind tried to process experiences that exceeded an 8-year-old's capacity for understanding. Sarah recognized the symptoms of shock and knew that without intervention, the child could slip into catatonic withdrawal that might prove irreversible. "Emma, sweetheart," she said softly, settling beside the girl while maintaining awareness of the other children's needs. "I know everything feels scary and confusing right now, but I want you to remember something very important your mama loves you so much that she was willing to let you come with me to this safe place. That love is stronger than anything that's happening outside." The gentle reminder of maternal love seemed to penetrate Emma's psychological barriers slightly. The child's eyes focused on Sarah's face, and she nodded almost imperceptibly while clutching her doll more tightly. It was a small victory, but in their current circumstances, any sign of psychological resilience felt like a major triumph. Mary Catherine Wells had appointed herself as Sarah's unofficial assistant, moving quietly between the younger children to provide comfort and maintain group discipline. Her maturity was both a blessing and a concern, helpful for managing immediate crises, but potentially damaging to her own emotional development if the responsibility became too heavy for her 12-year-old shoulders to bear. As evening approached, the sounds from the valley below began to change. The roar of burning buildings was replaced by occasional shouts and calls that carried clearly through the mountain air. Sarah strained to identify the voices, hoping to hear familiar accents and speech patterns that would indicate Willow Creek's defenders were still fighting. But the calls that reached her ears spoke languages she didn't recognize, suggesting that Grey Wolf's forces had achieved complete control of the settlement. The psychological impact on the children was immediate and devastating. Even those two, young to understand the tactical implications, could sense that the sounds of home had been replaced by something foreign and threatening. The last threads connecting them to their normal world were being severed, leaving them dependent entirely on Sarah's ability to create new sources of hope and security. "Are our parents?" James began, then stopped, unable to voice the question that terrorized all of them. "I don't know what's happening to our families," Sarah answered honestly, recognizing that false reassurance would destroy the trust that kept their group functioning. "But I do know that the adults in our community are strong and smart people who knew this danger was coming. They had time to prepare, and they had plans for staying safe, just like they had plans for keeping you safe." The explanation was truthful, as far as it went, but Sarah knew that preparation and planning meant little when facing overwhelming force. The burning settlement below represented the possible destruction of everything these children had known and loved, including the parents whose reunion they had been promised. But dwelling on possibilities beyond their control would serve no purpose, except to demoralize everyone when their survival depended on maintaining hope and discipline. Sarah forced herself to focus on immediate necessities, managing their limited food and water supplies, maintaining sanitary conditions in their confined space, and most critically, preparing for the possibility that their hiding place might yet be discovered. The evening meal was consumed in near total silence, each child lost in private fears while Sarah wrestled with decisions that could determine their fate. Their food supplies were adequate for perhaps 4 more days if carefully rationed, but their water situation was more precarious. The natural spring that served the cave system was located in a connecting passage that required exposure to potential observation from outside. More concerning was the psychological deterioration she was observing in all 5 children. Emma's withdrawal was deepening despite gentle encouragement. Bobby Henderson was approaching complete emotional collapse. Even Mary Catherine's remarkable maturity was showing signs of strain as the weight of adult concerns pressed against her. Child's understanding. James Patterson remained their greatest behavioral risk. His natural leadership and protective instincts, creating pressure that might explode into reckless action if their situation didn't improve. Sarah could see him calculating distances to the settlement, assessing weapons and possibilities, planning heroic gestures that would accomplish nothing except adding his death to the day's casualties. But it was Billy Henderson who presented the most unpredictable element in their group dynamic. His adaptation to cave life had been so complete that he seemed almost excited by their underground adventure, treating their desperate situation like an elaborate game. That psychological disconnect from reality could prove dangerous if it led him to take risks that endangered everyone else. As darkness settled over the Colorado mountains, Sarah gathered her charges for what had become their evening ritual of stories and quiet conversation. But tonight, the familiar routine felt strained and artificial against the backdrop of destruction that surrounded their hiding place. The comfortable normalcy she had tried to maintain was crumbling under the weight of circumstances that exceeded her ability to control or explain. "Miss Manning," Mary Catherine whispered as the other children settled into their sleeping places, "what if they don't stop looking for us? What if we can never go home?" The questions cut to the heart of Sarah's own deepest fears. Their hiding place had protected them for 3 days, but every hour increased the likelihood that systematic searches would eventually reveal their location. More critically, the destruction of Willow Creek meant that even if they survived their cave ordeal, they might emerge to find a world that no longer contained the families and community that had given their lives meaning. "Then we'll find a way to build something new," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "People have survived worse things than this, and they've found ways to create new homes and new families when the old ones were taken away. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The promise was both a hope and a vow, something Sarah intended to keep regardless of what personal cost that commitment might require. These 5 children represented more than just her students or her responsibility. They were the future, the proof that love and care could survive even when everything else was destroyed. But outside their stone walls, forces were moving through. The darkness that would soon test every promise she had made and every skill she possessed. The real confrontation was approaching, and Sarah Manning was about to discover whether a teacher's love could truly stand against the fury of a Comanche war chief who had never known defeat. The 3rd night in the caves brought a stillness that felt more ominous than the earlier sounds of destruction. The smoke that had choked the mountain air throughout the day was finally beginning to clear. But it was replaced by something far more unsettling, the absolute silence that followed. Complete devastation. No distant voices carried on the wind, no sounds of livestock or human activity echoed from the valley below. Willow Creek settlement had been erased so thoroughly that even its death throes had ended. Sarah sat in the deepest shadows of their chamber, watching 5 sleeping forms that represented her entire world and responsibility. The steady breathing of exhausted children provided the only comfort in a situation that seemed to grow more hopeless with each passing hour. Their food supplies had dwindled to perhaps 2 days' worth of careful rationing. More critically, the psychological pressure was creating fractures in their group dynamic that threatened to shatter their unity completely. Emma Thompson's sleep was restless, marked by soft whimpers and the constant clutching of her doll that had become her only connection to the security she had lost. During waking hours, the 8-year-old had withdrawn so completely that she barely responded to direct questions, existing in a protective bubble of denial that worried Sarah more than open hysteria would have. James Patterson's heroic impulses had evolved into a dangerous obsession with escape and rescue that was becoming harder to control. Earlier that evening, she had caught him attempting to map the cave system's connecting passages, clearly planning some form of reconnaissance mission that would expose him to capture or death. His 10-year-old mind couldn't accept the helplessness of their situation, and that inability to process powerlessness was driving him toward increasingly reckless schemes. Mary Catherine Wells continued to function as Sarah's unofficial assistant, but the 12-year-old's remarkable composure was showing cracks that suggested impending collapse. The responsibility she had accepted for helping manage the younger children was creating pressure that would have challenged adults, and Sarah recognized that even the most mature child had limits that were being approached rapidly. The Henderson twins presented the most volatile element in their group. Bobby's psychological withdrawal had progressed to near catatonia, while Billy's disconnection from reality was manifesting as inappropriate cheerfulness that ignored their desperate circumstances. The brothers' divergent responses to trauma were creating tension that could explode into crisis at any moment. But Sarah's greatest concern was her own deteriorating ability to project the confidence and security that kept their small community functioning. 3 days of constant vigilance, minimal sleep, and overwhelming responsibility were eroding her mental reserves. More troubling were the doubts that plagued her during the long hours of darkness, doubts about her decisions, her capabilities, and most fundamentally, whether her promise to protect these children had any meaning when faced with forces completely beyond her control. Sound that shattered the night's stillness was so subtle that Sarah almost dismissed it as imagination, born of exhaustion and stress. A soft scraping, like leather against stone, came from somewhere in the connecting passages that linked their main chamber to the cave system's deeper reaches. She held her breath, straining to determine whether the noise represented a genuine threat or simply her overwrought nerves creating dangers where none existed. The scraping came again, closer and more distinct. Something was moving through the cave system with the careful deliberation of a predator that had detected prey, but was taking time to assess the situation before striking. Sarah's blood turned to ice water as she realized that their worst fear was materializing. Their hiding place had been discovered, and whatever was approaching through the darkness was moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where to find them. Her hand moved instinctively to the loaded pistol that had become her constant companion, but she knew that gunfire in the confines of the cave would be as dangerous to the children as to any attacker. The ricochet of bullets off stone walls could create casualties even if her aim proved accurate, and the noise would certainly alert any other searchers in the area to their exact location. The children remained asleep, their exhaustion so complete that even subconscious danger signals couldn't penetrate their mental defenses. Sarah faced a terrible dilemma: wake them and risk panic that could prove fatal, or allow them to sleep and hope that whatever was approaching might somehow miss their concealed position. The decision was made for her when a soft voice spoke from the connecting passage, words in Comanche dialect that she couldn't understand but whose tone carried unmistakable authority. The speaker was close enough that she could hear breathing, close enough that discovery was inevitable within moments. Sarah positioned herself between the children and the passage entrance, her weapon ready but held low to avoid creating immediate confrontation. A figure emerged from the darkness with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable moving through dangerous terrain in absolute silence. Even in the dim light of their dying fire, Sarah could see that this was no ordinary warrior. The man's bearing spoke of command and confidence earned through years of successful leadership. His clothing was practical, but bore decorative elements that marked him as someone of significant status within his community. When he stepped fully into the firelight, Sarah found herself face to face with a legend. Chief Gray Wolf stood before her, his dark eyes taking in every detail of their makeshift shelter with the swift assessment of a military tactician evaluating tactical situations. But those same eyes also registered the presence of 5 sleeping children, with an expression that Sarah couldn't immediately interpret. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and protector studied each other across a space, measured in feet but representing an unbridgeable gulf between different worlds and different definitions of justice. Sarah's finger rested on her pistol's trigger, knowing that she possessed enough firepower to wound or possibly kill the man who had destroyed everything she cared about. But she also knew that gunfire would accomplish nothing except ensuring that all 6 of them died together instead of facing whatever alternative Grey Wolf might offer. "You are the teacher," he said in carefully pronounced English, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention without requiring volume. "The woman who hides the children of the eagle killers." The reference to eagle killers was clearly meant as an insult directed at the Willow Creek settlers, but Sarah detected something in Grey Wolf's tone that suggested this encounter might not follow the pattern she had been dreading. There was curiosity in his manner, even a kind of respect that seemed inconsistent with his reputation for ruthless efficiency in eliminating enemies. "I am Sarah Manning," she replied with as much dignity as she could muster while kneeling in a cave with a loaded weapon pointed toward the most feared war chief in 3 territories. "And these are children, not eagle killers. They've never harmed anyone." Grey Wolf's expression shifted slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the man who might exist beneath the legendary warrior. His eyes moved over the sleeping forms with an assessment that seemed more protective than predatory, as if he were calculating their vulnerability rather than planning their destruction. "Children," he repeated, as if testing the word's meaning in his mouth. "White children who will grow into white adults who will take more land, kill more buffalo, break more promises." The statement was delivered without heat, more like a logical analysis than an emotional condemnation. But Sarah recognized it as a challenge that required a response demonstrating more than simple maternal protection. This was a test of her understanding of the larger forces that had brought them to this moment of confrontation. "Or they will grow into adults who remember that a Comanche chief chose mercy when he could have chosen revenge," she replied carefully. "Children who understand that honor and courage aren't determined by the color of someone's skin, but by the choices people make when they have power over those who are helpless." The philosophical challenge seemed to surprise Grey Wolf, whose expression suggested he hadn't expected to encounter reasoned argument in a cave filled with terrified refugees. For several heartbeats, he remained silent, and Sarah could almost see him processing implications that extended far beyond their immediate situation. Behind him, she could hear soft movements that indicated other warriors were positioned throughout the cave system. Their escape routes had been cut off, and their tactical situation was hopeless. But something in Grey Wolf's manner suggested that brute force might not be his intended solution to the problem they represented. "You speak of mercy as if it were possible," he said finally. "But mercy requires trust, and trust has been destroyed by too many broken promises, too many betrayals. How does a teacher rebuild what warriors have torn down?" The question revealed depths that Sarah hadn't expected from someone whose reputation emphasized military prowess rather than philosophical sophistication. Grey Wolf was testing her understanding of the deeper issues that had created this conflict, evaluating whether she possessed wisdom that might offer alternatives to the cycle of violence that had consumed both their peoples. But before she could formulate a response, movement among the children indicated that their conversation had begun to penetrate exhausted sleep. Emma Thompson stirred restlessly, her small voice calling out for her mother in tones that would have melted the hardest heart. The sound seemed to affect Grey Wolf more than any argument Sarah could have made, demonstrating the universal vulnerability that connected all children regardless of their cultural background. Mary Catherine Wells opened her eyes and immediately assessed their situation with the rapid intelligence that had made her invaluable during their cave ordeal. But instead of screaming or panicking, the 12-year-old sat up slowly and regarded Gray Wolf with the kind of calm curiosity that suggested she understood she was witnessing a moment of historical significance. "Are you the chief who burned our houses?" she asked with the direct honesty that characterized frontier children who had learned early that survival often depended on understanding truth rather than clinging to comfortable illusions. Gray Wolf's response to the child's question would determine whether the next few minutes brought enlightenment or catastrophe. Sarah held her breath, knowing that everything she had promised these children about protection and safety was about to be tested by forces completely beyond her ability to control or influence. The midnight hour was approaching, and with it, a confrontation that would define not just their immediate survival, but the kind of legacy that would emerge from the ashes of Willow Creek Settlement. Gray Wolf's response to Mary Catherine's question came not in words, but in an action that transformed the entire dynamic of their encounter. The legendary war chief slowly lowered himself to sit cross-legged beside their dying fire, his movements deliberate and non-threatening despite the fact that his warriors controlled every possible escape route. The gesture spoke of someone prepared for extended conversation rather than immediate violence. "Yes, young one," he said quietly, his English careful but clear. "I am the chief whose warriors burned your settlement. But before you judge me as only a destroyer, perhaps you should know why those fires were lit." Mary Catherine's 12-year-old mind processed this information with the kind of directness that adults often found uncomfortable. "Our parents said you were angry about soldiers killing your families. Is that true?" The child's ability to cut through complicated politics to essential human motivations seemed to surprise Gray Wolf. His weathered features shifted through several expressions before settling into something that might have been respect mixed with sadness. "Soldiers wearing blue coats came to our winter camp 3 moons ago," he began, his voice carrying the weight of memories that clearly caused him pain. "They said they were hunting warriors who had raided settlements. But when the shooting started, it was not warriors who died. It was children like you, grandmothers, mothers holding babies." Sarah felt her understanding of their situation shift dramatically as Gray Wolf continued his account. This wasn't simply a raid motivated by opportunism or general hostility toward white settlements. This was retaliation for specific atrocities that had created a cycle of violence neither side seemed capable of breaking. By now, all 5 children were awake and listening with the intense focus that dangerous situations created. In young minds, Emma Thompson had instinctively moved closer to Sarah, but her tears had stopped as curiosity replaced terror. James Patterson sat rigidly alert, his 10-year-old warrior instincts evaluating threat levels while his more developed empathy struggled to process Gray Wolf's account of loss. The Henderson twins presented a study in contrasts. Billy maintained his disconnected cheerfulness, apparently viewing Gray Wolf's presence as an exciting addition to their cave adventure. Bobby remained withdrawn, but his attention was clearly focused on the conversation that would determine their fate. "How many children died in your camp?" Mary Catherine asked with the kind of relentless honesty that made adults squirm, but often elicited truth that polite conversation couldn't access. Gray Wolf's jaw tightened, and for a moment Sarah feared that the child's directness had pushed their captor beyond his tolerance for painful memories. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady despite the emotion that shadowed his features. 17 children, 6 grandmothers, 9 mothers. The soldiers said later that it was a mistake, that they thought everyone in the camp was hostile. But bullets do not care about mistakes, and the dead do not return because of apologies. The stark arithmetic of loss hung in the cave air like smoke from their dying fire. Sarah found herself doing involuntary calculations. 17 indigenous children killed by soldiers, balanced against how many settler children who might die in retaliation. The mathematics of revenge created equations that never balanced, never provided resolution, only perpetuated cycles that consumed innocence on both sides. "So you decided to kill our parents to make the soldiers sorry?" Emma Thompson asked her. 8-year-old logic, struggling to understand connections between distant military actions and the destruction of her world. "I decided to make the people who send soldiers understand that actions have consequences," Grey Wolf corrected gently. "Your settlement was chosen because the men who lived there had served as scouts for the cavalry unit that attacked our camp. They guided the soldiers to our winter lodges." Sarah's blood chilled as she processed this information. If Grey Wolf was telling the truth, then Willow Creek hadn't been selected randomly but had been targeted specifically because of its residents' connections to military actions. The men she had known as neighbors and fellow community members had participated in events that led directly to the massacre, Grey Wolf described. But even more disturbing was the implication that the children's parents, people she had respected and cared about, might have been complicit in atrocities against indigenous families. The moral landscape of their situation was far more complex than the simple narrative of innocent settlers versus savage raiders that she had been carrying. James Patterson's natural leadership instincts couldn't tolerate the passive role their conversation was forcing on him. If our fathers did bad things, then punish them. But why burn everything? Why hurt people who didn't do anything wrong? The question demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of justice that impressed both Sarah and Grey Wolf. At 10 years old, James was grappling with concepts that challenged mature moral reasoning, trying to find principles that could navigate between legitimate grievance and disproportionate response. Because, Grey Wolf replied with patient gravity, when children die, the pain spreads to everyone who loved them. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all carry wounds that never heal. I wanted the people who caused that pain to understand what it feels like to lose everything that gives life meaning. The explanation revealed a calculating intelligence behind Grey Wolf's campaign that went far beyond simple revenge. He had orchestrated psychological warfare designed to create understanding through shared suffering, forcing his enemies to experience losses equivalent to what his people had endured. Mary. Catherine nodded slowly, her 12-year-old mind processing moral complexities that would have challenged philosophy professors. "So you made them hurt the way you hurt. But now there are more people on both sides who have lost children. Doesn't that just make everything worse?" The child's insight struck at the fundamental flaw in revenge-based justice, and Sarah could see that Grey Wolf recognized the logical trap his strategy had created. Each act of retaliation generated new grievances that demanded their own responses, creating expanding circles of violence that consumed innocence on all sides. "You are wise for one so young," Grey Wolf said quietly. "Yes, the circle of pain grows larger instead of smaller. But when your heart is filled with the sounds of dying children, wisdom becomes harder to find than you might imagine." Bobby Henderson spoke for the first time since their ordeal began, his 6-year-old voice barely above a whisper. "Are you going to kill us too?" The direct question that everyone had been avoiding forced Grey Wolf to confront the central issue that had brought him to their cave. His original mission had been to eliminate any survivors who might carry word of his campaign to territorial authorities. But facing 5 children whose innocence was undeniable was clearly creating moral challenges he hadn't anticipated. "I came here to finish what was started," he said slowly, "to ensure that no one remained who could guide soldiers back to my people. But now I find children who speak of justice and ask questions that warriors avoid." Sarah recognized this as the crucial moment when their fate would be determined. Grey Wolf was experiencing the same moral conflict that had driven his campaign, the tension between legitimate grievance and proportionate response. Her words in the next few moments might determine whether they lived or died. "Chief Grey Wolf," she said carefully, You have the power to choose how your story ends. You can be remembered as the warrior who answered atrocity with atrocity, or as the leader who found the strength to break a cycle that was destroying both our peoples. And if I choose mercy, he replied, what prevents these children from growing into adults who guide more soldiers to more camps where more children die? The question cut to the heart of his dilemma. Mercy toward these 5 might enable future atrocities against his own people, but killing them would guarantee that the cycle of violence continued indefinitely. It was a variation of the ancient philosophical problem of preventing future harm through present action, but it was Billy Henderson who provided an answer that neither adult had anticipated. The 6-year-old, who had remained cheerfully disconnected from their desperate circumstances, suddenly spoke with clarity that seemed to surprise even himself. Maybe if you teach us about your children who died, we'll remember them and make sure soldiers don't hurt any more kids. But if you kill us, nobody will ever know their names or why they were special. The innocent logic was devastating in its simplicity. Gray Wolf could perpetuate the cycle of violence that had already claimed too many lives, or he could transform these 5 children into living memorials to his own losses. Their survival could serve his people's memory better than their deaths could serve his desire for revenge. Sarah watched Gray Wolf's face as he processed this unexpected perspective. The war chief was clearly struggling with implications that extended far beyond their immediate situation. His decision would establish precedent that could influence how future conflicts were resolved, determining whether leaders chose escalation or sought alternatives to endless retaliation. The midnight hour was approaching, and with it, a choice that would echo through history long after the names of everyone present had been forgotten by all except those whose lives they had touched. The silence that followed. Billy Henderson's unexpected wisdom stretched through the cave like a held breath, carrying implications that seemed to surprise everyone present, including the 6-year-old who had spoken them. Gray Wolf's weathered features revealed the internal struggle of a man confronting possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. For 3 months, his entire existence had been focused on a campaign of retribution that seemed to offer the only path toward honoring his dead. Now a child was suggesting an alternative that could transform tragedy into legacy. Sarah watched the war chief's face, recognizing the exact moment when his perspective began to shift. It was subtle, a softening around his eyes, a slight relaxation in the rigid posture that had defined him as an instrument of vengeance. But she had spent 3 years reading the faces of children learning difficult lessons, and she could see that Gray Wolf was experiencing the same kind of transformative understanding that marked genuine education. "Tell me about your children," Mary Catherine said quietly, her 12-year-old intuition recognizing that this was the crucial moment when enemies could become something else entirely. "What were their names? What did they like to do? We want to remember them the right way." The request seemed to catch Gray Wolf completely off guard. Warriors were accustomed to having their strength tested, their courage challenged, their tactical abilities evaluated. But having someone ask about the personal details that made loss meaningful was apparently outside his experience of how conflicts were supposed to unfold. For several heartbeats, he remained silent, and Sarah feared that Mary Catherine's directness had pushed him back toward the simple certainties of revenge. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a tenderness that transformed the legendary war chief into a grieving father whose pain happened to wear war paint. "Little Fox was 7 winters old," he began, his English becoming more halting as emotion complicated his careful pronunciation. "She could track rabbits through snow so light that grown hunters lost the trail. Her laugh was like water running over stones in spring." Emma Thompson's 8-year-old heart immediately connected with the image of a child only slightly younger than herself. Did she have a favorite doll or toy? "A carved wooden horse that her grandfather made," Gray Wolf replied, his voice growing stronger as memories overwhelmed present circumstances. She would gallop it through the air, making sounds like thunder while she told stories about magical rides across the sky. The detail created an immediate bridge between cultures, connecting Emma's beloved cloth doll with little Fox's wooden horse in a way that transcended the barriers that had seemed insurmountable moments earlier. Both children had used imagination to transform simple objects into sources of comfort and joy, proving that some aspects of human nature remained constant regardless of skin color or cultural background. James Patterson's natural leadership instincts were beginning to process possibilities that extended far beyond their immediate survival. Were there other children in your band? Kids who are still alive but miss their friends who died? The question revealed sophisticated thinking about community dynamics and the ongoing impact of loss on survivors. Gray Wolf nodded slowly, clearly recognizing that this 10-year-old understood implications that many adults preferred to ignore. Running. Bear lost his sister and his best friend. He has 8 winters now, but he has not laughed since the soldiers came. Bright Star lost her twin brother. She sits by the river and talks to water, hoping his spirit will hear her words. The descriptions created immediate connections between the indigenous children, who were struggling with grief, and the settler children who faced their own losses. Bobby Henderson, who had been silent and withdrawn since their ordeal began, suddenly looked up with interest that suggested his own experience of separation from his twin brother had given him insight into Bright Star's pain. "Does Bright Star have other brothers or sisters?" Bobby asked, speaking more clearly than he had in days. "She has an older sister who tries to comfort her, but twins share something that others cannot understand," Gray Wolf replied. "The sister means well, but she cannot fill the empty space that Bright Star carries." Bobby nodded with the solemn understanding of someone whose own twin connection had been tested by their cave ordeal. Despite being separated by only a few feet, the psychological pressures of their situation had created distance between him and Billy that he was only beginning to recognize and articulate. Sarah realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented. In her experience of frontier conflicts, the moment when enemies discovered their shared humanity through recognition of common losses and universal emotions, the children were accomplishing what armies and politicians had failed to achieve, creating understanding that transcended cultural barriers through simple acknowledgement of each other's pain. But she also recognized that this breakthrough was fragile and could be destroyed by careless words or inappropriate actions. Gray Wolf was revealing vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone seeking tactical advantage, trusting that these children would honor his emotional openness rather than using it against him. "Chief Gray Wolf," she said carefully, "what you're sharing with us is precious. These children will carry the memory of Little Fox and Running Bear and Bright Star for the rest of their lives. Your people's losses won't be forgotten, and the names of your children will be spoken in prayers and remembered in stories." The promise seemed to affect Gray Wolf more powerfully than any argument about mercy or justice could have achieved. His campaign of revenge had been motivated by the desire to ensure that his people's suffering wouldn't be dismissed or forgotten by those responsible for causing it. The possibility that their enemies' children might become guardians of their memory offered a form of honor that violence could never provide. But Billy Henderson, whose innocent wisdom had opened this unexpected door, wasn't finished with his contributions to their conversation. The 6-year-old studied Gray Wolf with the kind of intense curiosity that adults often found uncomfortable. "Are you sad that you burned our houses?" Billy asked with characteristic directness. "Do you wish you could make different choices?" The question struck at the heart of Gray Wolf's internal conflict in a way that sophisticated philosophical arguments couldn't match. The child was asking whether the war chief regretted actions that had seemed necessary when viewed through the lens of grief and anger, but might appear differently when filtered through recognition of shared humanity. Gray Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes moving between the 5 faces that watched him with complete attention. When he finally spoke, His words carried the weight of someone confronting truths that he had been avoiding since his campaign began. When I saw the smoke rising from your settlement, I felt satisfaction. The people who had guided soldiers to kill my children were experiencing their own losses. But now, sitting with children who ask about Little Fox's wooden horse and Running Bear's sadness, I begin to understand that revenge and justice are not the same thing. Mary Catherine nodded with the solemn wisdom of someone far older than her. 12 years. Mama always said that you can't heal a wound by making more wounds. Maybe the only way to stop the hurting is to start the healing. The philosophical insight was remarkable coming from a child, but Sarah recognized it as the kind of wisdom that frontier life could generate in young people who had been forced to confront adult realities at ages when most children were still protected from serious hardships. James Patterson, whose heroic instincts had been frustrated by their passive situation, suddenly found a role that matched his natural leadership abilities. Chief Gray Wolf, what if we made a promise? What if we promised to tell everyone about Little Fox and Running Bear and Bright Star, but you promised to tell your people about Emma and Mary Catherine and Billy and Bobby and me? The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity, creating mutual obligation that could serve both communities' needs while honoring the memory of all children who had been lost to violence. It transformed potential enemies into custodians of each other's most precious memories. Sarah could see that Gray Wolf was seriously considering the possibility, weighing it against the original mission that had brought him to their cave. His warriors were still positioned throughout the connecting passages, ready to complete the elimination of witnesses that his strategic planning had deemed necessary. But the tactical situation had evolved into something that rendered military solutions inadequate. Emma Thompson, who had remained largely silent since Gray Wolf's arrival, suddenly spoke with the kind of clarity that grief sometimes created in young minds. If you kill us, then Little Fox and Running Bear won't have anyone to remember them except people who are already sad. But if you let us live, then lots of people will know their names and their stories. The 8-year-old's logic was devastatingly simple and irrefutable. Gray Wolf's original plan would have achieved tactical objectives while failing to serve the deeper purpose that had motivated his entire campaign. His people's losses would remain known only within their own community, dismissed by the larger world that preferred to forget uncomfortable truths about the cost of westward expansion. But preserving these 5 children would create living memorials who could carry indigenous stories into settler communities that might otherwise never encounter them. Their survival could serve his people's memory more effectively than their deaths, could serve his desire for revenge. Gray Wolf rose slowly to his feet, his movements deliberate as he processed implications that extended far beyond their immediate situation. The decision he made in the next few moments would determine not only whether 6 people lived or died, but whether future conflicts would follow patterns of escalating violence or discover new possibilities for resolution. Gray Wolf stood in the flickering firelight, his imposing figure casting shadows that danced across the cave walls like spirits from another world. The war chief who had entered their sanctuary as an instrument of vengeance was now wrestling with possibilities that challenged everything his grief-driven campaign had represented. Sarah could see the internal battle playing out across his weathered features as duty warred with emerging wisdom. Anger struggled against unexpected compassion. From the connecting passages, soft sounds indicated that his warriors were growing restless. They had followed their chief into these mountains, expecting to complete a mission of elimination, not to engage in philosophical discussions with enemy children. Sarah understood that Gray Wolf faced pressure from his own people that might override any personal inclinations toward mercy he was developing. "Chief Gray Wolf," Mary Catherine said quietly, her 12-year-old voice carrying remarkable steadiness. "In the face of their uncertain fate, can you tell your warriors about us? About what we've been talking about? Maybe they need to understand too." The suggestion was both brave and dangerous. Introducing more voices into their delicate negotiation could either strengthen the case for mercy or provide additional arguments for completing their original mission. But Mary Catherine had demonstrated throughout their ordeal that her instincts about human nature were remarkably accurate for someone so young. Gray Wolf considered the proposal for several heartbeats before calling out in Comanche dialect to his hidden warriors. The conversation that followed was too rapid and complex for Sarah to follow, but she could hear tones shifting from military crispness to something approaching debate. Whatever Gray Wolf was telling his men about their encounter was clearly challenging their expectations, assumptions. 3 warriors emerged from the darkness, their faces painted for war, but their expressions revealing curiosity about the unusual scene before them. These were experienced fighters who had followed their chief through countless conflicts, men whose loyalty was absolute but whose intelligence allowed them to recognize when situations deviated from established patterns. The youngest of the 3, barely older than James Patterson, spoke directly to Gray Wolf in accented English. "My chief, the children are enemies who will grow to guide more soldiers. Why do we talk when we should act?" The challenge came from someone Sarah recognized as embodying the same heroic impulses that drove James toward reckless courage. Young warriors in any culture seemed prone to seeing complex problems through simple lenses, preferring action to contemplation even when action might prove counterproductive. But before Gray Wolf could respond, Emma Thompson did something that transformed the entire dynamic of their confrontation. The 8-year-old rose from her position beside Sarah and walked directly toward the young warrior, her small hands clutching the cloth doll that had been her constant companion throughout their ordeal. "This is my friend," she said simply, holding up the worn doll for the warrior to examine. "Her name is Lucy, and she helps me not be scared when everything feels wrong." "Do you have something that helps you when you're scared?" The innocent question struck at universal human needs that transcended cultural boundaries. The young warrior's painted face revealed confusion as he processed this unexpected approach to their encounter. He had been prepared for defiance, pleading, or desperate bargaining, but not for a child treating him as a potential friend who might understand her emotional challenges. James Patterson immediately grasped the strategic brilliance of Emma's instinctive diplomacy and decided to build upon it. "My pa was a soldier before he became a farmer. He said warriors from all tribes carry things that remind them of home and family. What do you carry?" The question revealed sophisticated understanding of military psychology that impressed both Gray Wolf and his men. This 10-year-old had identified a common thread that connected fighters across cultural lines, demonstrating that some aspects of human nature remained constant regardless of the causes people fought for. The young warrior's hand moved unconsciously to a leather pouch hanging from his belt, and Sarah could see him struggling with the impulse to share personal details with people he had been taught to view as enemies. But Emma's openness had created an atmosphere where such sharing felt natural rather than dangerous. "A stone from the place where my grandfather was born," he admitted reluctantly. "He said it would keep his spirit close to mine during battles far from home." Billy Henderson, whose disconnected cheerfulness had evolved into genuine wisdom during their cave ordeal, immediately responded to this revelation with characteristic directness. "That's like how we sing songs our grandmas taught us when we miss them. Different words, but the same feeling." The 6-year-old's observation about cultural universality was profound in its simplicity, identifying emotional constants that existed beneath surface differences of language, appearance, and custom. His innocent wisdom was accomplishing what diplomatic negotiations had failed to achieve, creating recognition of shared humanity that transcended tribal boundaries. Sarah realized that she was witnessing an educational process unlike anything she had experienced in 3 years of frontier teaching. These children were learning and demonstrating lessons about human nature, conflict resolution, and cultural understanding that most adults never mastered. Their natural empathy and curiosity were dissolving barriers that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier. But the most remarkable transformation was occurring in Grey Wolf himself. The legendary war chief was observing interactions between his warriors and enemy, children that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of conflict and the possibility of resolution. His original mission had been based on the belief that cultural differences made coexistence impossible, but these conversations were proving that belief incorrect. Bobby Henderson, who had remained withdrawn and fearful throughout most of their ordeal, suddenly found his voice in a way that surprised everyone present. "Chief Grey Wolf, do the children in your band play games? We know some games that don't need special toys or anything. Maybe Running Bear and Bright Star would like to learn them." The suggestion that indigenous and settler children might find common ground through play was both innocent and revolutionary. It implied possibilities for cultural exchange that could benefit both communities, while honoring the memory of those who had been lost. More importantly, it offered a framework for healing that focused on building new connections rather than dwelling on past grievances. The eldest of Grey Wolf's warriors, a man whose graying hair spoke of decades of frontier conflict, stepped forward with an expression that combined surprise with grudging respect. "These children speak of things that old men forget," he said in careful English. "Perhaps there are paths we have not considered." The admission from an experienced fighter that children might possess wisdom unavailable to warriors represented a fundamental shift in how their encounter was being perceived. Military solutions were giving way to possibilities that required different kinds of courage and different definitions of strength. Sarah recognized this as the crucial moment when their fate would be determined. Grey Wolf had been presented with alternatives to the revenge that had driven his campaign. His warriors had been exposed to evidence that their enemies possessed humanity worth preserving. And the children had demonstrated that cultural bridges could be built through empathy and mutual recognition. But she also understood that such transformations were fragile and could be destroyed by careless words or inappropriate actions. The next few minutes would determine whether this unprecedented encounter resulted in breakthrough or tragedy. "Chief Grey Wolf," she said carefully, knowing that her words carried the weight of 6 lives and potentially much more. "You came here tonight to finish something that soldiers started when they attacked your winter camp. But maybe what needs to be finished isn't what you originally thought." The war chief's dark eyes met hers across the flickering firelight, and Sarah could see him weighing implications that extended far beyond their immediate situation. His decision would establish precedent that could influence how future conflicts were resolved, determining whether leaders chose escalation or sought alternatives to endless cycles of retaliation. "What do you think needs to be finished, teacher?" he asked quietly, the question carrying genuine curiosity about perspectives that might differ from his own. "The idea that we have to be enemies," Sarah replied simply. "The belief that your losses can only be honored through our deaths, or that our security can only be achieved through your destruction. Maybe what needs to finish is the assumption that different peoples can't find ways to live without destroying each other." The proposal was audacious in its implications, suggesting that their midnight encounter could serve as a model for resolving conflicts that had consumed the frontier for generations. But Sarah had spent 3 years teaching children that impossible things became possible when approached with creativity, patience, and genuine desire for positive outcomes. Mary Catherine Wells nodded with the solemn wisdom that had characterized her throughout their ordeal. "Maybe instead of finishing something bad, we could start something good. Something that would make Little Fox and Running Bear proud instead of just making more people sad." The 12-year-old's insight captured the essence of transformative thinking that could convert tragedy into opportunity for growth and understanding. Her suggestion that they honor the dead through building rather than destroying offered Grey Wolf a path toward meaningful legacy that revenge could never provide. As midnight approached in the Colorado mountains, a war chief faced the most important decision of his life, knowing that his choice would echo through history and determine whether future generations inherited cycles of violence or discovered new possibilities for peace. The moment of decision arrived not with dramatic flourish, but with the quiet certainty that characterizes truly transformative choices. Gray Wolf stood in the center of their makeshift sanctuary, surrounded by his warriors, facing 5 children and 1 teacher who had fundamentally altered his understanding of justice, memory, and the true meaning of strength. The midnight hour had passed, but instead of bringing death, it had delivered possibilities that none of them could have imagined when darkness first fell over the Colorado mountains. "My warriors," Gray Wolf said in English, ensuring that everyone present could understand his words. "We came to these caves to silence voices that might call soldiers back to our people. But we have found something unexpected, voices that could speak for our children instead of against them." The eldest warrior nodded slowly, his weathered features reflecting the same transformation that had occurred in his chief. "The little ones carry no weapons except truth. Perhaps truth serves our people better than silence." Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized that the conversation was moving toward resolution rather than delay. These weren't theoretical discussions about mercy and justice. Anymore, they were practical negotiations about how to honor the dead while protecting the living, how to break cycles of violence while maintaining tribal security. Emma Thompson, whose innocent diplomacy had opened doors that seemed permanently sealed, stepped forward with the kind of courage that only children possessed. "Chief Gray Wolf, if you let us live, we promise to tell everyone about Little Fox and Running Bear and Bright Star. We'll make sure their names are remembered in our prayers and in the stories we tell our own children someday." The 8-year-old's pledge carried the weight of sacred vow, delivered with solemnity that transformed a child's promise into something approaching tribal treaty. Her words acknowledged that memory was indeed a form of immortality, perhaps more powerful and lasting than the temporary satisfaction that revenge could provide. James Patterson immediately built upon Emma's commitment with the natural leadership that had characterized him throughout their ordeal. "And we'll learn about your customs and traditions so we can honor your children the right way. We don't want to just remember their names. We want to understand what made them special in your culture." The 10-year-old's insight demonstrated sophisticated understanding of cultural respect that went far beyond simple remembrance. He was proposing genuine learning and appreciation that could serve as bridges between communities that had previously seen each other only as threats. Mary Catherine Wells added her own dimension to their emerging agreement. "Chief Gray Wolf, would it be possible for us to meet Running Bear and Bright Star someday? Not to take them away from their people, but to share stories and games and maybe help each other heal from losing the friends we all miss." The 12-year-old's suggestion was revolutionary in its implications, proposing direct contact between indigenous and settler children that could create understanding impossible to achieve through adult negotiations. Her idea offered hope for healing that benefited survivors on both sides, rather than simply perpetuating cycles of loss. But it was Billy Henderson whose final contribution proved most decisive in Gray Wolf's thinking. The 6-year-old, whose innocent wisdom had been instrumental in opening this unexpected dialogue, walked directly to the war chief and looked up at him with complete trust. "Chief Gray Wolf, will you teach us some words in your language so we can say our prayers for Little Fox and Running Bear properly? We want to talk to them the way they would understand." The request was so soulful, so purely motivated by desire to honor indigenous traditions, rather than impose settler customs, that it completed Gray Wolf's transformation from instrument of vengeance to guardian of cultural bridge building. This child was asking to learn Comanche language not for tactical advantage, but for spiritual connection, demonstrating respect that transcended political considerations. Gray Wolf knelt to bring himself to Billy's eye level, his weathered hands gentle as he placed them on the child's shoulders. When he spoke, His voice carried the kind of quiet authority that commanded absolute attention from everyone present. "Little warrior, your heart speaks words that old chiefs sometimes forget. Yes, I will teach you to pray for our children in the language they knew best. And perhaps you will teach me prayers from your people that honor all children who have been lost to this conflict." The exchange represented more than simple cultural sharing. It was the foundation for mutual understanding that could transform how future conflicts were approached and resolved. Gray Wolf was agreeing to become not just a preserver of his own people's traditions, but a bridge between different ways of honoring life and mourning loss. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized that her students had accomplished something that politicians, military leaders, and territorial officials had failed to achieve. Through simple empathy, honest questions, and genuine desire to understand rather than dominate, 5 children had convinced a legendary war chief to choose building over destroying, healing over hurting. The practical arrangements that followed, their emotional breakthrough, required careful consideration of details that would determine whether their agreement could survive contact with the outside world. Gray Wolf's band would withdraw from the immediate area, but they would establish communication protocols that allowed for ongoing dialogue between communities. The children would be escorted back to what remained of Willow Creek Settlement, where they would find other survivors who had hidden successfully during the raid. Sarah's role would evolve from teacher to cultural liaison, helping to establish educational programs that included indigenous perspectives alongside traditional frontier curricula. Most importantly, Gray Wolf would carry word of their encounter to other tribal leaders, demonstrating that alternatives to endless warfare were possible when approached with creativity and genuine respect for human dignity on both sides. "Teacher," Gray Wolf said as his warriors prepared to escort them safely back to the valley below, "you have taught me something that no battle ever could. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not by defeating enemies, but by discovering that they were never truly enemies at all." The observation captured the essence of their transformation from mutual threat to mutual possibility. Sarah recognized that her own understanding had been fundamentally altered by witnessing children transcend barriers that adults had assumed were permanent and insurmountable. As they prepared to leave the cave that had been their sanctuary for 4 days and 3 nights, each child took a moment to say goodbye to the place where they had learned lessons about courage, resilience, and the power of human connection to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Emma Thompson carefully packed her cloth doll, but now Lucy represented more than simple comfort. She had become a bridge between cultures, a tangible reminder that children's needs and emotions transcended racial and cultural boundaries. James Patterson had evolved from restless boy into young leader whose understanding of true courage now included the wisdom to choose difficult conversations over easy violence. His natural protective instincts had been refined by experience with genuine moral complexity. Mary Catherine Wells had demonstrated maturity and wisdom that would serve her well as she grew into a woman who could navigate between different worlds with respect and understanding. Her questions had been instrumental in creating the dialogue that saved all their lives. Bobby Henderson had found his voice through recognition that other children shared his struggles with loss and separation. His empathy for Bright Star's grief had helped him begin processing his own emotional challenges. Billy Henderson had revealed that innocence and wisdom weren't contradictory, that sometimes the most profound insights came from minds unburdened by adult prejudices and assumptions. His innocent questions had opened doors that sophisticated arguments couldn't touch. The dawn that greeted them as they emerged from the cave system was unlike any sunrise Sarah had ever experienced. The light seemed brighter, the air cleaner, the possibilities infinite. The world they were returning to had been damaged by conflict, but it was also a world where 5 children had proven that understanding was possible across any divide. In the months that followed, the story of the midnight encounter in the Colorado caves would spread throughout the territory and beyond, becoming legend in some tellings but always retaining its essential truth that children possess wisdom adults often lack, that enemies can become allies when approached with genuine respect, and that the strongest bridges are built not from stone and steel, but from empathy and shared recognition of common humanity. Sarah Manning returned to teaching, but her classroom now included lessons about Comanche culture, indigenous perspectives on land and community, and the importance of remembering all children who had been lost to conflicts that could have been resolved through understanding rather than violence. Emma Thompson grew up to become a translator and cultural mediator. Her childhood experience with Gray Wolf, inspiring a lifetime dedicated to building bridges between different communities. James Patterson became a territorial judge, known for seeking restorative rather than punitive justice. Mary Catherine Wells established schools that served children from multiple cultural backgrounds. Bobby Henderson became a physician who specialized in treating trauma in children affected by conflict. Billy Henderson became a storyteller whose tales carried lessons about the power of innocent wisdom to transform the world. And in a Comanche band, somewhere in the vast territories of the American West, Running Bear learned to laugh again as he played games taught to him by children he had never met, but whose generosity had honored his sister's memory. Bright Star discovered that talking to water could become talking to new friends who understood that some losses could be healed through connection rather than isolation. The cave in the Colorado mountains remained, its granite walls holding memories of the night when 5 children and 1 teacher discovered that the darkness between peoples could be illuminated by the simple light of human compassion. And sometimes when the wind was right and the moon was full, travelers in that high country reported hearing the sound of children's laughter, echoing from stone chambers where enemies had learned to become family. The greatest lesson of that midnight encounter wasn't about survival or courage, though both were required in abundance. It was about the power of innocence to see possibilities that experience had taught adults to dismiss, the wisdom of children to ask questions that warriors had learned to avoid, and the truth that the strongest victories are won not through conquest but through the patient work of building understanding across the chasms that seem to divide us from one another. In a world determined to teach that differences made people enemies, 5 children had proven that differences could make people stronger, wiser, and more complete. And that lesson echoed through time, carried in the hearts of all who heard their story and dared to believe that love was indeed more powerful than hate, that building was more satisfying than destroying, and that the future belonged to those brave enough to see enemies as potential friends waiting to be discovered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.